Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis. So I remember more or less when the first English language version of Persepolis came out. It was originally written in French. I think it was around, I want to say 2003. Yeah. So the first version, this is the complete Persepolis, volumes 1 and 2. The first English language version of volume 1 came out in 2003. First English language version of volume 2 came out in 2004. And I remember because it was this really, strikingly different depiction of the Islamic world and what we were seeing in mainstream US media in 2003, 2004. I mean, this was the early days of the war on terror. The war in Iraq began in 2003 with the US and coalition invasion. And so Persepolis, it was not from Iraq. It was not from Afghanistan. But Iran was, Americans, even today, many Americans do not know that much about the Middle East, despite the fact that we've been more or less continually entangled in very distinct ways since at least the early 1990s. But many Americans are not particularly well educated about other parts of the world. I don't think that's a controversial statement. And so having this sort of graphic novel that became this huge sensation, I think I read this for high school. I was in high school in 2003 and 2004. I think I read this in high school. I think I read this in undergrad. And I think I read this actually, I might have, no, I think actually when I was an undergrad, Shepherd University, where I went to undergrad, used to do a community reads thing where basically the school would choose a book and they'd put on a ton of events and things, and everybody would read and discuss this particular book. Persepolis was one of the books that we did for that. And it was this strikingly different depiction of the life and reality of individuals in the Middle East, in the Islamic world, as opposed to what we were getting from the Bush administration and the U.S. news media, which was mostly depicting the Middle East and Muslims as terrorists, as fundamentalists, as crazy ideologues, and whatever it was, rather than accepting that these were real people with complexities and lives and hopes and dreams and aspirations and challenges and loves and losses and ambitions and all of these things that make human beings the beautiful, complex, crazy, often horrific beings that we are. And Satrapi's Persepolis gave us an insight, gave us a window into that world, because her story starts shortly before the Islamic Revolution of 1979, and brings us up through her sort of various struggles with her identity, with politics, with religion, with fundamentalism, with relationships, with family, all of these things. It's not an exclusively political book. It is an autobiographical graphic novel. And so there is a lot in it that is not immediately about politics, but politics is always there, in part because the Islamic fundamentalist regime in Iran is or at least for times has been, a pretty fundamentalist and authoritarian government that exercises significant amounts of control over individual choice, individual behavior, etc., etc. And we get this right from the beginning. Actually, the introduction talks about a little bit about the history of Iran, or Persia as it had been known. And again, many people in the US, many people in the West, I think in general, do not know that much about Middle Eastern history. And so having that very short history is quite, I think, useful. But the first section is called The Veil, and it introduces this element where prior to the Islamic Revolution, many Iranian women had not worn hijab, had not worn the burqa, had not worn any of the sort of traditional Islamic or Middle Eastern Arab headscarves, head coverings. But the Islamic Revolution mandated it. It removed a lot of women's rights and freedoms. Iran had been quite a liberal, advanced country in terms of women's rights compared to the 1950s and early 60s. And the Islamic Revolution very much changed that. And so that actually is a big component of this story, is the struggle to just live a sort of normal, comfortable life. Like later on, when Satrapi grows up, like she struggles to have relationships with potential boyfriends or potential husbands or whatever. And so we get these sort of elements where, like, this panel says, the outside being dangerous, we often found ourselves inside, at his house or at my house. This situation was suffocating me. We couldn't do anything else but close in on each other. And so these elements of political repression are always there, even in question or issues like the way that the characters dress, the way they talk to one another, the way they physically interact in public, what they do in private versus what they do in public. And even what they do in private can be a source of danger, because we see a number of instances where people are having parties or whatever it is, and they get raided by the Revolutionary Guard, who are the sort of Islamic, the government's sort of shock troops, / morality police, I guess is maybe the term. So Satrapi's life in Iran is governed by these sets of rules and by this general struggle to sort of get around them and to live what she considers a normal life, to have regular relationships with other human beings, etc., etc. But what we also see is that the West is not necessarily better. And so this is one of the big things, right? That was really sort of almost a revolutionary idea in the early 2000s. Because one of the things, and of course this was total bullshit, but one of the things that the Bush regime sort of argued was, we have to go and liberate Afghani women and Iraqi women because the Islamic governments there are repressive and bad for women. This, of course, was just total nonsense. That was never a serious objective. And if it was, they did a shitty job of trying to achieve it. But one of the things that Satrapi points out, or points to, is that when she went to Austria, because her parents sent her to Austria to study, to try and get her out of Iran. She experienced xenophobia, she experienced poverty, she experienced alienation, indifference, people who were these sort of goth type people who were interested in death as a sort of conceptual thing, but actually did not sort of understand it or know anything about it. And like, she experiences poverty and homelessness and drug addiction and things like this. And so, and then she comes back to Iran, and she's back into this sort of repressive world where you have to wear the veil in public. You can't be seen in public with a man you're not married to, and all of these things. And what we get ultimately is this complicated story in which people are resisting this Islamic fundamentalist government and its rules, its guidelines, its regulations, its demands on people. And it's resisting them in these subtle ways in order to try and live just normal lives. And that was, again, quite a different thing than what we were seeing in the mainstream news media in the early 2000s. And so, in that sense, it was a very, very striking difference. It was it was, again, revolutionary almost in its depiction of people in the Islamic world as people, as regular people with lives and hopes and ambitions, rather than just as these wild suicide bombers and whatever it was.